70 years ago, 1945, May 1945, was a marvellous time to be alive. Just at the very end of April, Mussolini, the Italian leader, had been executed by his own countrymen, and then, marvel of marvels, Hitler committed suicide. It was obvious then that the war would be drifting to an end, and it was only a matter of time. On the 7th of May, the Germans signed the Act of Surrender, and on the 8th of May it was declared to be VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, and there were huge celebrations all over the country. Well, our celebrations weren't quite that huge. In fact, we had a bonfire at the foot of Brander Street on the battery site, which had been built to repel the Russians, funnily enough, at the time of the Crimea. After a few days, it was admitted that we were still at war because we still had to fight the Japanese. It took another several months to kill off the war in the Pacific. And during that time, the Air Force started again in their training program, doing what we used to call circuits and bumps. They would just go round the town and settle down for seconds and back up again. Mainly in Wellingtons. That was one of the RAF's favourite planes, which was in continuous service throughout the entire war. One of the Wellingtons had been giving trouble, and it was put up to test the engines to see whether the engines were in proper working order. It flew around the town, and sadly it crashed into the town up at Church Street, knocking the top off the roof and the back of the block of 4 council houses. So there's the picture of the remains of the building, taking the top story off and leaving the bottom story more or less intact. Sadly, it killed Joey Flood and her 5 boys. It also killed the lady in the next door flat. It was occupied by Mrs. Allen and her foster daughter Vera. Those who died were Joey Flood and her sons Jackie, James, Sinclair, George and David. Jackie was the same age as me. He was in the other half of our class, so we were both 14 at the time. Mrs. Allen was a widow because her husband had been killed in the First World War, and her only son was killed in the Second World War in the shambles before Dunkirk. Vera was her foster daughter. The crew of 3, because it wasn't a training plane, it was just up for an engine test, they died. Pilot Officer Rickard from Blackley in Manchester, Pilot Officer Cameron from Edinburgh, and Sergeant Mawby from South Ealing in London. There's a picture showing the area with the space occupied now only by debris. And if we do a close-up of it, on the very left-hand edge of the screen is the area which was hit by a Wellington 6 weeks earlier. It went down on the edge of the sea town, went into a space which it fitted into so exactly that it didn't actually damage the houses on either side, with a clearance of roughly 2 feet. The bodies were removed from the scene, and on the Tuesday there was a funeral which was attended by the entire population of Lossie. The funeral service was held at the disused church, which had been turned into a mortuary for the war. And the service was taken by Mr. Salmon, who was the High Kirk minister. You can see the coffins lying there: Joey, Jackie, James, and 3 white coffins for the younger people. I don't think anybody who was there will ever forget the sight of these 3 white coffins with the children. The coffins were loaded onto RAF trucks. The articulated truck, which was called the Queen Mary at that time, we used to think they were huge, but they're small by today's standards. And the cortege moved off straight up to the cemetery, led by the RAF pipe and drum band playing the Floors of the Forest. We preceded the wagons. I was one of 200 schoolboys, no girls. Women didn't attend funerals at that time. Classmates of the dead children. I was in the second row behind Ian Boyd and Leslie Roy, who were carrying wreaths for the boys and girls to remember the dead children. When we got up there, the floods were buried in the corner, and eventually a simple plaque was erected to the graves. It was paid for by a collection of money from their friends and neighbours. Vera and Mrs. Allen were buried further over, and again had a very simple stone, a token of respect from neighbours and friends in memory of Edith Allen and Vera, who were accidentally killed May 20th, 1945. The house was rebuilt as near as possible identical to the previous house, which had been destroyed. And eventually in 1995, that was the 50th anniversary, a small plaque was placed in the garden as a reminder of the fact that there had been this accident, and it was in memory of the 8 civilians and 3 aircrew who lost their lives, and also to the memory of all other civilians and servicemen who were killed in Lossiemouth during World War II. In fact, there were 385 RAF personnel killed in flying accidents at the time that the RAF were flying from 1939 through to 1945. After that plaque was erected, I had produced a booklet of the people who died during the war based on the war memorial and other material. I got a letter from a man in Australia. Alf wrote to tell me that he had been a witness, been an eyewitness to this accident. And he said, "Quite a few Wellingtons took off that day. I was the rear gunner in our plane. I just sat, looking back at the next plane to take off. When this plane took off, I noticed that while we were gaining height, he wasn't. I switched on my intercom and said to the skipper, 'This guy behind us is taking a hell of a long time to get up.' As I said this, the other plane went into a dive and crashed into the town. I sat there and watched it go down. It was an awful feeling, not being able to do anything about it. It's something that I will never forget." And of course, one of the reasons why the population of Lossie was very concerned about the crash was that it was only 2 months from the time that Wellington had crashed in the sea town. It did remarkably little damage because it came down between 2 rows of houses, knocked over 3 wooden sheds, and damaged the houses mainly through fire and smoke. Didn't kill any of the locals, but 5 of the crew of 6 died. The rear gunner was thrown out and survived. This led the town council at its next meeting to consider the question of planes flying over the town, with a view to raising the matter with the RAF. We have, of course, been doing that ever since, without quite ever managing to get it right.